My name is Ryan Beam, and I'm a student at the University of Kentucky. Studying economics and statistics. In this series, I explore how data is applied in the real world and how the industry and field is continuing to evolve. Today, I'm joined by Jason Wattier, a senior data engineer at Q2, where he works closely with commercial lending clients and builds data integrations. Jason, thank you so much for being here.
Of course, happy to join and hopefully share a few nuggets of wisdom that I've accumulated over a decade or so of professional working experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate it. Just to start off, one of the things that I find most interesting about your career path is that you have a background in accounting, especially in your early career. And then could you kind of just walk me through how you transitioned from accounting and audit work into data engineering and what motivated that pivot?
Yeah, I've had a couple of, I'd say, pivots in my career. So just a kind of brief summary, coming out of college, which undergrad was Kentucky and graduate school was Ohio State and Columbus. Spent a year doing being an external auditor, meaning like auditing the financial statements of like publicly traded companies that you see on the stock exchange, Netflix, et cetera. Not auditing those, but auditing companies that like list their stock like those. Um, Spent a year there and then went to New York City for about 4 or 5 years at a different accounting firm, and then moved from New York City after had first kid down to Texas, and then accounting, even like within an accounting firm, I transitioned into kind of different roles, and I think so. Kind of the wanting to transition into different roles within my career usually came down to like one of two factors, and often both were in play in some capacity. Either I was intellectually bored by what I was doing. Like I just didn't, I wouldn't find it like that interesting, or I wanted also like a lifestyle change. Um, and so the intellectual part is I could just that's like different things vibe or resonate or find interest with different people. It's same with what books or movies or type of music you like. It also, I think, goes with like what you would enjoy spending a lot of time or enjoy enough to to have be your main focus at work. And I there are a lot of good things about a career in accounting. It's very like uh robust and resilient to economic ups and downs. It has a lot of verisimilitude, which is just a fancy word for meaning like it's very applicable in a lot of different companies in different areas of the country and of different sizes of different industries. Even if a company is not publicly traded, they still need like a accounting. So it was a good sort of fallback and a good sort of foundation to have because accounting is in essence sort of the language of business. It's how we communicate, as imperfect as it may be in some ways, of reflecting the kind of economic viability, especially the future economic viability of a company. It's the best we have. And so that was a good like is good foundation. But I found myself very quickly just not interested in it. I just was bored out of my mind. I remember uh one of my first days in sort of national training. A lot of these accounting firms and I think a lot of companies will fly out people at different levels, either new hires, et cetera, to a central location, Florida, or more closer to like where you're working and for like a week or so of training. And I remember just kind of looking up and looking around the room, and everybody was just looking at their computer. And I was just like, is this going to be my life? And now, granted, for most professions, you are looking at a computer. So I don't want people to say, well, if I look at a computer all day, I'm not out touching grass, like then the sky is falling. No, probably most jobs these days will be looking for a computer. But I just that sort of like feeling of not a lot of like intellectual like I just didn't. didn't really just engage me. And I get that like I was probably young and more of trying to go for that naive and pure vision of, oh, I want my job to fulfill me and make me happy, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I mean, that's not always the case. You can usually kind of get part of the way there, but it's very rare to find a job that you're like, it makes me happy, it doesn't make me stressed, it pays me enough money. Just it's possible, but it can be rare. So anyway, so that was me. That was Deloitte in Cincinnati. And then I started to think about like what else I could do without going back to college. And this actually doesn't relate to what I did next, but it led me to what my next stop was. I started to study for actuarial exams. So that's like the Along Came Polly, Ben Stiller character, sort of calculating like the overlap of risk and like putting like a dollar value to it. So it's often used. It's a sort of specific study of like statistics and probability and blah blah blah. Like mostly in insurance fields to help like price premiums, et cetera, for different insurance policies. And for that, you didn't for the actuarial career path, you didn't need to go back to college. And it also combined a lot of things that I was interested in at the time, statistics, a little bit of computer programming, and some economics and finance. So I was like, okay, it has some stuff that I'm interested in, and I don't have to go back to college. Let me start studying for these actuarial tests. And in the process of doing that, I talked with somebody who I graduated Ohio State with, a classmate, and she had worked for done sort of a not a postdoc, but like a 1 year post grad at the Financial Accounting Standards Board. So the governing body that sets the accounting rules by which publicly traded and private non-public companies follow. So you've been there and then gone to work for a different large accounting firm, KPMG, in New York City. And I was doing my I'm going to I was catching up her with her one day and telling her about the actuarial stuff I was doing, and she cautioned me and said, "Why don't you give what I'm doing a try?" Which was it was more of a consulting version of accounting, in that the kind of two within an accounting firm, there's primarily kind of two main buckets of accounting careers you can pursue. And oftentimes people transition from one or the other. There's more of the compliance, sort of regulatory oriented version that's called an external auditor or just an auditor, where you're kind of just a company says they sold 50 million, and you're like, prove it. So again, not necessarily combative or adversarial, but just less of like, you're not their partner in an explicit manner. You're not there to help them. You're there just as a sort of a duty of for the public good, for capital markets, etc. Um, but the other side is more it's kind of just being kind of a more specialized version of a McKinsey or Bain and Capital consultant, where they they often need either ad hoc advice on a complex sort of contract and its accounting implication, or they're wanting to do a merger and acquisition, and they need extra uh, person power, the extra bodies, and also the expertise on like a type of transaction that most companies are not buying and selling perpetually. And so they don't have the in-house knowledge or the in-house like excess capacity to facilitate sort of a special transaction. So that's sort of more, I guess, dynamic and more kind of like partnership oriented uh, focused sort of role was what she was doing. And I looked at the time, like I was in my mid 20s. I said, well, I don't have any girlfriend, any kids. Like New York City sounds like a great time and it is. probably best experienced like without kids, but anyway. Um, and I said, if I'm going to like any version of accounting, this is probably going to be it. So like, let me go. If it doesn't work out, like it doesn't work out, I can probably come back to Cincinnati or somewhere in the Midwest. Like, let me just give it a shot. So I did that, and I liked it. I liked it better. Um, so from a baseline of like meh, mid to like, yeah, this isn't too bad. But I still like even pretty early on, I was like, okay, I don't mind New York City, quite an adjustment, but like I grew to like it. And so that sort of like city shift was fine. But I still was like, I don't think I want to like bother with this. So um my next sort of transition, so we did Cincinnati, external auditor, New York City, more kind of consulting version of accounting. And then my next kind of transition was within these, I ended up gravitating a lot towards merger and acquisition projects. And all these projects, we had people we just called like, colloquially the data team, never had like a great label, but they were charged with, um, I guess let me back up and say why we needed them and why we needed that capacity. Um, Oftentimes, clients' sort of accounting information systems are not set up to hold two versions of the world, meaning they're not set up to say this is how I am right now. This is how my business and my company is now, versus like, well, here's a hypothetical scenario where I spin off a portion of my company or absorb someone else. Like they're just not set up to have those sort of two parallel worlds. Like until a transaction closes, you have to like still report to Wall Street to publish in your mandated quarterly and annual financial statements. You still have to report your business as it is currently and not be like forward looking. You provide forward looking guidance, but that's not the sort of like PB&J of what you need to do. That's not sort of your requirement. So that what the data team does is say, okay, let me replicate your existing, like at least at a summary level. It's not going to provide kind of all the nitty gritty detail, but at least like kind of at enough granularity where we can kind of Rubik's cube it and say, okay, we can take this kind of starting baseline that matches what you're currently doing and layer on adjustments and this sort of outside of the outside of the company's books, create kind of this separate parallel track and maintain that parallel track that is more of the forward looking structure. Because when a transaction closes, you've got to like almost turn around on the spot and have that stuff ready. I mean, there's a little bit of leeway, but you got to have it like very soon. So that's the data team would kind of try to replicate closely enough the company's sort of accounting process to create their current financial statements so that we could layer on the necessary kind of tweaks and adjustments that get them to the future state that they will need to put into financial statements when the clock strikes midnight on the transaction. And I had one of those um, one of those team members was on site at a project that I had in Houston, Texas for offshore oil drilling company that was selling off a portion of its fleet. And it was big enough that would require sort of um, those transaction financial statements. And I looked at his screen and it wasn't like he was doing like a SQL editor, and SQL structured query language is sort of the basic language for most like databases and in terms of querying them and interacting with them in some way. So he's writing SQL, and I was like, that's not zeros and ones. I can do that. I'd done a Visual Basic of a VBA class at University of Kentucky, and that was like my first exposure to any sort of coding. Um, and I loved it. It was kind of essentially helped you write macros or other sort of like utility applications within Excel. primarily. And I love that. And so I saw that SQL stuff. I'm like, oh, I could do that. Like it's not that hard. So I I studied up. I got like a Microsoft certification. Again, I sat for a test and passed tests. I was very, very good at passing tests. And also, with I think I'd met my wife at that point, but no kids. So I'll kind of one things I'll reflect upon in terms of milestone transition after this uh, 5 hour Avatar 3 length diatribe is finished. I'll kind of some words of wisdom. But anyway, so I kind of studied up enough, and did something that, in terms of that certification part, was it had like a dual purpose. One is, okay, I have to, like, maybe I'm not going to be an expert in this, but like sitting for a test like m means that I have to know something well enough. But also, and probably more importantly, it's a signal to this individual that I met that was on our data team, that I was serious and had put the time and effort to like to want to pursue something. So I ended up kind of grabbing him for a quick coffee chat at one of these sort of annual national trainings that we had, and said, I'm interested in like giving the data team a try. And I don't think he had anything on the spot available, but like I think within like half a year, a few months, he said, hey, we got something available. Why don't you come and try it out? Um, and so that, I think it was initially kind of just more of a temporary thing, and then it ended up being like a permanent transfer. Um, and that's where I spent the rest of my career at KPMG, is that in this sort of in a data team role, but kind of a data team that existed on projects to kind of, again, ease the sort of logistical and reporting burden of keeping this, parallel track of financial statements. And oftentimes it was more than just sort of aggregate level numbers. It could get into like stuff that was also pertinent to not only the financial statements, but also like kind of post deal sort of closing in, like keeping like detailed track of fixed assets. So that's going to be like equipment, computer, building, et cetera. So kind of anything that's like physical, um, like keeping kind of track of that, and keeping track of kind of it's um, not only trying to replicate and kind of have it as support for a large number on a balance sheet. Because any company that's not a tech company, typically most of their assets, assuming they're not, Warren Beatty's company and they have a crap load in cash, is going to be like physical assets. So I did that for probably almost half, or a little bit more than half of my 10 years at KPMG. And one of the reasons, other than the technical interest, that I had in mind, is I wanted to be traveling a little bit less. I still ended up traveling quite a bit at KPMG. Um, but I wanted to travel less, and I also wanted to have a little bit more sort of just personal flexibility. At that time, I'd met my wife, and we had kid number one and also kid number three, called 1 plus 2 twins equals 3. And so I was also like, typically a role in that's IT-ish related is generally going to be a little bit more flexible than something like accounting or business oriented role, where on balance there's a little bit more push to being in office. Um, and then I would say kind of the last pivot was from KPMG to where I'm right now. And that's the main reason for that was not the intellectual side, but it was more so the personal family side, and in wanting to get off the consulting roller coaster, because I had just had enough. Because the consulting, like when you're on a project, you could get an email Friday night over the weekend, and not saying you always have to drop what you do, but it's very much that a lot of your life is governed by the project. And there is a lot of flexibility in these. It's not just, I'm not wanting to paint kind of doom and gloom, but I I just was at a point where I didn't want to do that anymore. I didn't want to have kind of the regularity of weekend work or late night work. And so that sort of transition into Q2 was just about having something that was a better match for like having three kids in a family. All right, so that was a lot. That was almost an entire podcast episode of me rambling, but I kind of a couple things um to take away is in terms of kind of career pivots, they're generally speaking, I think, easier to do earlier, and also a little bit easier like when you don't have a lot of personal responsibility. And that's comes from just time standpoint. Like it's easier to set aside time outside of work when you don't have wife or just other kind of family obligations. A lot of what I would do when I was either studying early on for the actuarial stuff that didn't end up kind of I didn't end up kind of really pursuing other than a quick cup of coffee at KPMG. Another some of those one of those try it out before you buy it sort of rotations, but not like a full transfer into that group. Um, and then also with the sequels, I like um after work, I would before I would go home or go back to the hotel room if I was on the road, I would go to a coffee shop before I'd go home. So that way it's just like, oh, hey, this is just part of my day. Um, you know, and it kind of was easy to accommodate in that way. Now, if I want to get some extra like kind of professional development learning time, the end of my workday leads into the kids getting home from school. And oftentimes it's not, you know, probably not the best parenting practice. Be like, sorry guys, I'm going to go to the coffee shop for 3 hours. I'll see you guys after you go to bed. No, I got to wait until they go to bed. So, again, kind of career transitions and also just making time for career transitions if they require a lot of kind of um, technical learning or any sort of learning that's again just a little bit easier to do earlier. And then another thing that helped each of my transitions was usually I knew somebody in the company or the group that I was going to. It is so valuable to have. Like when I went from Deloitte, I had done a summer internship in their Cincinnati office. Um, and so I was given a job from that. So I had to, even in the midst of the financial crisis, I had like a job going in the 2008 financial crisis. Unfortunately, I have to distinguish between financial crisis. Um, and then from Deloitte to KPMG in New York City, that was someone I knew at Ohio State that worked at KPMG, worked in the group I was going to. And same thing in sort of the different sort of internal transfers within KPMG. Like I didn't have to leave KPMG to go do a different job. A lot of times, if you're working at a big enough company, big enough sort of consulting firm, you can often try out different groups without like the formal sort of HR application process. If you know someone high up enough in the group that you're wanting to go to, oftentimes if you it came down to me expressing an interest, me showing enough um in some way, like passing a test or getting a certification, showing enough that I was like serious versus like, well, I read an article about actuarial or I read, something about I picked up a sequel book, just something that also kind of demonstrated sincerity and interest. Um, they having kind of uh, people that you have some level of familiarity with doesn't need to be your best friend. You just know them enough that you can reach out to them is so invaluable because otherwise any organization you're going to or any field is a black box. And having someone that you know, or that you can just kind of have unvarnished questions like, what's it like? Is it shit? Is it like, am I getting kind of hoodwinked? It's so it's so invaluable. And I'll kind of um on that uh continuing this thread, going from KPMG to Q2, I met that individual going to Python conferences. It just kind of happenstance. Like I met kind of enough people and ran into this individual that when I was having this sort of just funky moment from a personal standpoint, I reached out to them and they said, I think you there might be a group that matches your background with like my current company. And that's that doesn't always kind of seal the deal. It's not like, well, you know somebody well enough and they'll um, speak well on your behalf to recruiters, so it also increases your chances. Like that, it's not as simple as that, but that's a very good head start. I'll give like an example of like when I didn't result in success, but it still helped me out. As when I was at KPMG, I think I'd been on the data team for a little bit, so again, transition from the accounting side to the to data side. And I had someone who went from KPMG to Google. I got like all the way to kind of office visit. So the final round, I think I did like pretty well. I didn't knock it out of the park. I did pretty well, but I didn't get the offer. So again, it's not like you don't have to do anything else, or you don't have to rely on kind of other things that are outside of your control, like luck or the interviewer just doesn't vibe with you. But again, it's a huge help. So wow, that was a lot of me talking. Any like any part of that that you're more kind of interested in diving into, or like we can go on to some of these other topics, but that kind of is, I'd say, a pretty good canvas of kind of just my different career pivots and transitions and some points of emphasis that helped me in each of those.
Absolutely. I think a lot of that was super insightful, and I find a lot of comfort in that you're able to pivot when you saw that things weren't as intellectually stimulating or didn't work for your new lifestyle, whether that be kids or wanting to travel less. Because just knowing myself coming into college, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do because I was just found so many different things interesting. And while I'm trying to kind of funnel that down into one career path outside of college. Um, it's difficult, and I can see myself wanting to pivot in my career. And I think it's actually interesting that you mentioned the actuary thing because that was something that a couple weeks ago actually I read something about being an actuary. I was like, that's pretty
That doesn't
interesting.
sound too bad. Yeah, you just get
Yeah.
like that one article and you're kind
Yeah.
of like that dog in Up. You're like squirrel, different career idea.
Absolutely.
Um, yeah, I think like you had a couple topics for discussion in terms of like, as a person in undergrad, like what bit of advice would you get? I think I would two kind of main things, or maybe one main point and one sub point is like it's very hard to decide what you want to do completely in here. Like you can do some research that sort of is
Mhm.
good to do a little bit, but like after a certain point, you're just kind of like existing in your own head. So I would say as much as you can try to find ways, either kind of just reaching out LinkedIn or just using kind of university connections, family connections, whatever, like try to talk to someone in that field. I, I remember initially starting college and wanting to do something either nursing or doctor, kind of medical field, because I was like, I want to help people, and that's why I should be in medicine. Anyway, one day I shadowed someone at a local hospital, and I was like, why do you like what you do? And this individual was like, you have someone's life in your hands, and that's a burden, but that's also a rush. And after that, I was like, I don't want that. Decision made. But you kind of like, I don't really kind of get that. You don't get as kind of raw or as instant feedback by just kind of existing in just, you know, pristine kind of four walls and a computer screen. So as much as you can, trying to like talk, like shadow or even kind of have coffee chats with people, because usually people make time for, you know, giving career advice because you're not asking like never kind of approach it as like I'm interested in getting a job or internship, like um, you know, even if that's maybe your end goal, but just like, you know, coffee chats kind of like this. But that helps kind of provide like just better quality feedback in sampling than just article reading because that can kind of just flow with the flavor of the wind. And I think the other sub point is like trying to like do the other thing, but like again, that's maybe coming shadowing, that's internships. That can also be like if there's a topic of interest, usually there's lots of free resources available. Like if you're interested in coding, there's free code camp. Um, so kind of trying to go for like low investment from a money and time standpoint, but just something that's better than just like you read something on the internet.
Right, right. And that's, yeah, I think that's a really good advice there. And that's part of, what I'm trying to do with this series is speak with people in these data related roles. And because absolutely, it's really hard to just read an article and then decide this is what I want to do or this is not what I want to do. Um, so yeah, I really appreciate that. Just moving on to more of something you mentioned in your kind of introduction there was that, you've had all these moments where you've got this certification, you've took the time to learn this skill. And something that I saw that you had recently done is work through some of Zach Wilson's data courses. And so I was wondering, as a person who's working in the industry and has that real world experience, what value did you get from that, if any? And how that relates to, on the job experience.
Yeah, I think I did get a lot of like value. They were again more on the expensive end because it was more of a live online course.
Mm.
But I did like his courses, and I guess kind of just something more broadly is I think some amount of outside learning is good for your career. Not saying like okay, you have to be quote unquote just grinding the midnight oil, but some level of supplementation is good, even if it's kind of still within your area of focus, because what you are working on in a day-to-day basis is often like much more narrow than the scope of like other things you could potentially do within that field. Um, and so I think learning helps supplement, it kind of provides more of a general, well-rounded uh, understanding of a topic or knowledge of a topic than what you might be kind of just privy to on the job. Because the job's focus is not necessarily, well, let's make the best Ryan we can. It's like, okay, we want to make the widgets. Um, and then, I mean, if they're a good company, they're also, realize that like part of our, uh, the value of the company is our value of our individuals. But often kind of companies aren't playing that sort of four-dimensional chess. And most of the time, the sort of learning and development is on you. So that's that's where these can be helpful. And I'd say kind of one thing I would caution against because I've done this and in hindsight kind of I I wouldn't have done them again is probably be careful of if you have a job that doesn't have kind of a standard schedule, be careful of doing things that require intense schedule commitments that you might not be able to follow through on. And usually those also coincide with like more expensive things. Like I did um a data science boot camp 3 months where I took like some time off work, and then that was like with 3 kids, and I think in hindsight it wasn't the 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 best. So kind of again be I think generally speaking going for like uh books or again course online learning platforms that have more like flexibility in terms of like your level of involvement and investment from a time standpoint are good. Now, that does require you to be a little bit more like disciplined, because maybe you don't have that sort of like pressure of like, oh, I put up this much money. Um, but again, I think is it's a generally good advice is not go for the all or nothing, but go for more so the steady Eddie.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that because I was interested to see, as somebody in the field and working, because it's a little bit different from my perspective, where I have a lot more free time. I have the time to kind of dive into a lot of different things. So I
I think
think,
a lot of times those you can learn the same stuff often. What you won't get is learn the same technical stuff. What you might not get as much of is live feedback.
right, right.
Um, but sometimes that feedback is not coming from like a professor of like 10 years. It's coming from somebody who just did the program, who knows a little bit more than you. So it's like, it's helpful, but it's like
Yeah.
maybe not to the degree that the your time and money investment is.
Well, something that has kind of stood out to me in your background, and you touched on that earlier, kind of at Deloitte and now Q2, is that client-faced working environment. So working as a data engineer where you're dealing with people that are a little less in the technical side of things and working with the business leaders and things along those lines, how do you navigate those relationships and how to communicate between that sometimes that disconnect between not being as technical?
Yeah, so I'd say the two things you want to try to go for, and this is like, I'd say either with you're communicating with people in different technical areas or different kind of domains, business units, whatever, different companies. You want to go for a combination of brevity, like get to the point. Like if you only have that sort of elevator speeds, if you only have like 30 seconds or whatever, like what is the point? And then simplicity, like you got to be able to like meet your you got to be able to talk about like it with one of your buddies who is not doing what you're doing because people have you just got to think about like what is that person dealing with their knowledge is their own technical area, not the sort of like vernacular or the technical terms that you're involved with. And they also have like 5 kids, a million things swirling around in their head. Like you the attention span is like very brief. And so again, brevity and being as untechnical as possible. Like for example, if you're trying to talk about an incomplete data population, you don't say, well, the right unjoin of this function resulted in 300 records. No, you say, we could not find 300 of these records when we tried to reference from this file to that file. It's the same thing, but you put join and unjoin and
Mhm.
all that semantical stuff, you're losing somebody. Whereas you just kind of describe it in more general terms, like you're going to have their attention, you're going to get like the feedback that you want to. And then depending on the audience, like you can kind of move off of those default positions as needed. And that's something I often like. I'd say I have it pretty well beaten into my head right now, but like even at Q2, like in terms of like emails to the client, like I needed to like I think I took that for granted a little bit. Because I was like, oh, I'm out of like the high pressure consulting environment. It can be just a little bit more loosey goosey. No, I got feedback early on in my time at Q2 is like, you need to work on your written communication. I need to like, and so yeah, that's kind of I would say it's not kind of just specific to the data field, but just it's critical in any sort of like professional verbal or written communication. You be as simple as you can and you also be as concise as you can.
Yeah, I think that's some really good information there. And kind of going off that realm of thinking where you've worked in the more business side of things within accounting. And I know you've now made the switch to the data side of things that is a little more technical. And I know for a while, you kind of saw the data team working and you thought about, oh, that looks interesting. And you kind of shifted in that. But From those, you've seen both sides of the coin. What do data engineers often misunderstand about the business context, and what do business leaders often misunderstand about the data?
I'd say what the data or technical side might not understand about the business side is um, the data that you want is not always captured or captured in the granularity that you want. And that to kind of get maybe the to get the data you want, you often have to like go to multiple different teams and say, hey, I want you to change how you're doing something. I want you to like throw in log messages or capture it at a more kind of granular detail so that we can do, customer state analysis, like weekly active users. Like it's and that so I'd say the data you want, at least in terms of kind of having it be suitable for analysis, is not often there. And also, it's not often very tidy or clean because data is just, unless it's a sophisticated organization and they're just kind of, keeping the trains going. But, but yeah, so it's kind of working from like this assumption that data is ideal and it's in the shape and the form that's needed to kind of work with a programming language or a data pipeline, like right out of the like right when it's created. And it's very rarely is. So that's kind of the data to business side. The what the business to data side, I think often doesn't have a lot of insight into is not knowing whether a change request is a quick fix or a more significant effort. I'll give like an example. We had one of the things I worked on during an M&A project when I was on the data team side at KPMG was that kind of maintaining kind of itemized uh, fixed asset ledger, which ledger just means like the set of detailed records that represents like a large accounting number. Like, okay, you've got $10 billion in fixed assets. Like, okay, that's building one on Chestnut Street in Pennsylvania. That's forklift two. That's so um, they originally just brought those in. There were two fields, kind of asset number and sub number. And initially, the assumption was asset number was the unique sort of like kernel to identify something, and sub number was, something that occurred but was more like incidental, it was like computer, 2 of 50 sort of thing. Um, but it turned out that was like, no, that was also that sub number was needed from a unique standpoint. And the business side would have looked at that and said, well, we just adding another field, but what they were seeing as their end output and not knowing that we needed to rerun a process for kind of multiple different kind of geographical region data sources as well as different time periods. So again, something that they often might not have an appreciation for level of complexity and effort for change requests. So kind of being a little bit more, I'd say from the business side, it's helpful to view it, view IT or view kind of data less as support and more as a partner and try to say like, okay, what can we do? What's reasonable versus I need it done by this date. Kind of less being in a less prescriptive and more collaborative.
Yeah, thank you for that because that's something that relationship between the business and the technical side of things is something that I'm trying to kind of work to balance and be able to understand both sides going through my undergraduate. And I know obviously that's something I'll have to sculpt throughout the rest of my life, but it's part of the reason I wanted to do kind of economics and statistics and data science.
I think that's a very good idea from think of it as like diversification of skills, like you often hear in terms of finances, like diversification. But I also think it's good in terms of like to have like one field of like one field that's not like technical specific, like economics or finance, um, or accounting, or even whatever, something else. But I mean, economics is a pretty solid one. And then pair that with a technical field like statistics. I think if you go just all in on the technical, you almost like you have to be like Wonder Kid to kind of no, I mean, I guess not, not necessarily, but you know, like the bar that you have to cross. Like this is a lot with like people who are just like computer programmers. Like they have to hit like a more bar. Whereas like if you're like, well, I could be an economist that does a little bit of this, does some statistical, does some programming stuff, or I can be like a statistician who knows a little bit about economics. That's sort of like having a field to apply the technical know-how. That's the good combination. Like I think like my sort of dual role at KPMG of like having from the accounting field and be able to talk with those or be just have more of a sixth sense of where the business people or some of the accounting people are coming from. That was it's that combination that's really powerful versus just like one or the other and having to be like again having a higher bar to clear in that individual area versus like okay I could just be kind of like B plus in each area and that's like this is one where the sum of the parts is greater than the whole or whatever that silly saying is. So I think that's um it's really good kind of um it's a good approach to take to have kind of that combination.
Just to wrap up, you've had a long, successful career across, a couple different domains, and now in data. What is it about your work and data that kind of, gets you up in the morning, gets you excited?
Well, my kids get me up in the morning. Uh, I I think there's still so much to kind of learn, and part of that is like I don't have thousands and hours to like consume everything, and so it's like okay, well, of course there's always something for me to learn. But I still just kind of find those sorts of like the discussions that come up in work in work conversations where we're like okay how do we want to handle this client's like data situation, we're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, do we want to like make the hole smaller or do we want to like prune off the edges, those sort of like discussions both on sort of a technical or business level are they're interesting enough. I'm not saying like it's Friday night at 8 p.m. like am I going to look through different like Python pandas library functions? Like, probably not. I'm just gonna like, try not to spend too much time on YouTube and I'm gonna play video games. Uh, but in terms of like, okay, well, you you really can't get paid money for that, or I guess you can, but again, you gotta be like a good, like, good gamer, good like, React skills, etc. But in the land of like normal people, like it's I find the magic sauce of a job and it being kind of good enough, meaning you're not like, well, I can't wait to get out of here, or you're kind of always looking at the future, is it pays you enough, you're good enough at it, and it's interesting enough. And all those things are like not going for perfection. And I think a fourth thing is like, do you like well enough the people you work with? Because that's something that can like that's a wild card that like you can't predict in your careers. Like who you're working with, are they going to be supportive? Are they not going to be like territorial or just an asshole? Um, so yeah, so I think it's um and I think one thing I've gained through these different stops is just knowing kind of like what that good enough bar is. Because I think like starting out, it'd be like, I want to be on the like intellectual like curiosity standpoint, I want that to be a 9.5 out of 10, where I'm probably like now it's like it just needs to be like a 7 or a 6.5. It's nothing needs to be like a -3
Right.
or something like that, or a 1. So I think you get kind of an appreciation for like what's what's that sort of Goldilocks porridge mix of these different factors and what's good enough.
You've given me a lot of great information, a lot of great advice and insights. But if you're in my shoes, 19 years old, just trying to figure out what I want to do with my career, if you could kind of distill your advice into one final talking point, what advice would you give for me?
Talk to people. Talk to people in the fields that are of interest to you. And I think the feedback and the signals that you get from that help kind of refine your search, even if like your search is, I don't want to do that. That is very helpful to exclude something like going back to like me shadowing like that kind of nurse's office and just having that moment of clarity. So like from then on out, I was like, okay, I don't even need to like have that occupy, that brain space anymore. So kind of, you know, taking the time to try to do that, bit by bit.
All right. Well, thank you so much. You've given me a lot to think about, a lot of good information that I'll definitely reflect over. So I just really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to meet with me.
Of course, more than happy to do so.